and welcome to We Are Not a Stereotype, Breaking Down Asian Pacific American Bias. Thank you for being here with us for this inaugural series of talks created for educators by educators. My name is Andrea Kim Neighbors, and I'm the Manager of Education Initiatives at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center in Washington, D.C. We could not have made this talk and series possible without our brilliant speakers and educators, Healoha Johnston and Ashleigh Coren, who you'll be hearing from shortly. We're grateful for this space they're creating for us to talk about an important figure from the Kingdom of Hawaii, whose legacy continues to inspire and empower generations today. As Healoha, Ashleigh and I are in different parts of the United States and the Pacific, we want to begin this talk acknowledging the people and lands our speakers are currently on. We would like to acknowledge the people of the land, past, present, and future, the Piscataway, where the Smithsonian Institution is located, in Washington, D.C., and the Native Hawaiians of Hawaii, and the Piscataway where our speakers are based. We also want to take a moment to recognize those nations who are not acknowledged, yet occupy or have occupied the lands we teach on. I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, since this series would not be possible without their support. This project received federal support from the Asian Pacific American Initiatives Pool, as well as support from Expedia. We would like to thank them for sponsoring this series and for making this learning opportunity available online for teachers across the country. I'm now pleased to introduce you to Healoha Johnston, the Curator of Asian Pacific American Women's Cultural History at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, and Ashleigh Coren, the Women's History Content and Interpretation Curator at the National Portrait Gallery and the Smithsonian's American Women's History Initiative. Ashleigh and Healoha, thank you.
Hi, Ashleigh and Andrea. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be joining you today. As a Kanaka Wiwi, the interrogation and presentation of this topic is really important to me because I think it has certainly shaped and informed a lot of the misperceptions that persist about Hawaii. And I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of unpack some of these details with the two of you today.
Thank you both to Andrea and Healoha. As Andrea mentioned, my name is Ashleigh, and I'm both incredibly excited and humbled to be invited into this space. Like Healoha, I'd like to position my positionality. I am an American Black woman whose work is deeply invested in dismantling and divesting from white supremacy, particularly in regards to visual culture. But I'd like to also acknowledge that I am not an expert in the history of Asian Americans in this country. However, that being said, I am deeply invested in learning about this history, in creating opportunities for solidarity and to center the stories of Asian Americans in portraiture. So during this session today, Healoha and I will be looking at a portrait of Queen Lili'uokalani. And Healoha and I will be walking through a routine that can be used for both analyzing art and making connections between museum objects and culture and history. I'd like to start today's session by defining caricature, which we'll be discussing. And caricature is a picture, description, or imitation of a person in which certain striking characteristics are exaggerated in order to create a comic or grotesque effect. I also want to share another definition, and the word I also want us to examine today is tolerance. So I'm going to define tolerance from the program Teaching Tolerance, and they define tolerance as an understanding of the practices and the beliefs of others, even if they are different from your own. And we're going to circle back to this as we talk about the portrait. As we discuss and analyze the image today, I'd like everyone, including the folks who are watching, to think about the relationship between tolerance and caricature, particularly as we examine the depictions of people of color. So Healoha and I will be walking through a thinking routine called See, Wonder, Connect. And See, Wonder, Connect is a wonderful thinking routine to use if you're trying to establish connections between multiple objects. So what I'm going to do is that Healoha and I will be modeling the activity. She will be modeling See first, and we're going to take a minute just to look at the image. And as you're taking a look at this image, I'd like for everyone watching to be thinking about, the following, right? You want to be thinking about the sitter, who is the person depicted in this image. You want to be thinking about their pose, their facial expression, their clothing, hairstyle, settings, objects that appear in the object, colors that are being used, the setting, the medium, the scale, and the artistic style, which is caricature. So Healoha, I'll just give you a few seconds to take a look at the image. and, you know, to answer the first question, which is, what do you see?
I see a woman. Apparently, that is Queen Lili'uokalani, although I wouldn't have recognized it necessarily. But I can read that from the text. And she has feathers. She's wearing a garment made of feathers, a fan of feathers. She's next to the shoreline, yet she's wearing tights and high heels on the sand. She's standing in front of what looks like maybe a chopping block with an axe next to it. And it has text on the tombstone or that chopping block. There's also what looks like maybe a fire on, like a fire on the sand over there. Something's cooking or boiling. There's coconut trees in the background, perhaps implying the location of Queen Lili'uokalani. She's wearing a crown, which indicates perhaps her status.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So what Healoha just did was, so she looked at the work of art, she took a minute to pause and to take in what it was that she saw. And she listed words and phrases to describe the aspect of this work. So I want to sort of circle back before we move on to the next part of the routine to sort of talk about some of the things that Healoha has observed. So one of the things that you mentioned, Healoha, is some of your assumptions about who this person is and what they look like, right? And I sort of really want to dig into that, because I know that when I first saw this image, I assumed the sitter was Black. And this is based on my own sort of knowledge and research of racist imagery of African Americans, right? But then after sort of reading the object information, I had to sort of unpack my initial assumption and then sort of use that prior knowledge to develop sort of what it was that I was seeing, but also who it was that I was seeing, right? And so you mentioned that they're sort of I wouldn't necessarily call them cultural identifiers, right? Because this is a caricature. But would you sort of dive in a little bit more about sort of what some of those markers were?
Yeah, certainly. So feathers, in Hawaiian culture, feathers are considered, almost sacred, right? They were aligned, and like the visual association was that it was an indicator or a symbol of ali'i, because the ali'i were divine, right? So they were like the mediators between the heaven and the earth. They occupied a very different realm from the Makainana, or the people of the land. And so feathers and birds that fly at those heights that overlook the land and that protect and look out for the ecosystems, those were, that's why there was that association. And so oftentimes the most sacred garments and the most prized garments that belonged to the ali'i were made up of feathers. They didn't look at all like the garment that is depicted in this picture, but there is a certain, I would call it an appropriation, because there's the use of the feather, but it's completely miscontextualized and does not speak at all to the actual cultural context within which feathers would be used. You asked for some other, to kind of unpack some of the other indicators, and I'll say, as an art historian, images of the 1800s in Hawaii, coconut trees and volcanoes. That was how Hawaii was signified in a lot of depictions, especially ones that were coming out of Europe and the United States. The ocean and the volcano being among like some of the most, the world's greatest wonders. And empirical science at that time was investigating a lot of those, the scientific phenomenon of those geological features. And so we often see it represented in images. In this case, toward the later 1800s being more considered like a paradise rather than a geological specimen.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Healoha. I think one of the things that you mentioned that to me is really incredible is that you've positioned this particular object in conversation with other harmful imagery of the time period, right? Like this is a part of a history, a collection of images that have indicated what Hawaii should represent and what it should look like in visual culture. Would you mind talking a little bit more about, you know, some of the more historic symbols that are in this particular portrait? I see that there's a date in this image. Would you mind sharing more information about sort of why that date is so significant?
Yeah, you know, I think so the text that's written on what I'm calling either a chopping block or a tombstone, it refers to, it says Dole, 1894, and that refers to an individual, Sanford Dole, who was a member of the provisional government. Actually, he was a leader within the provisional government, who overthrew Queen Lili'uokalani's government. And 1894 is significant because the Kingdom of Hawaii was overthrown in 1893. At that time, it was being led by Queen Lili'uokalani. And when the government, the monarchy, the Hawaiian monarchy was overthrown, it was done so with the assistance of the US military. So Sanford Dole and a group of businessmen living in Hawaii called in the US government, the military, saying that their life was under threat. That wasn't the case. And we learned that it's not the case because in 1894, a commissioner named James Blount, who was assigned to investigate this situation from, at the time, the US president named Grover Cleveland, because his military was involved. And so he issued James Blount to investigate the situation to find out what really happened. And Blount's report, published in 1894, explains that in fact the US's involvement in overthrowing the Hawaiian government was an act of war and was illegal. And although Sanford Dole and others who'd established their own oligarchy, which they called the provisional government, in fact, President Grover Cleveland suggested that he resign and be removed from any position of authority, and Grover Cleveland wanted to restore the monarchy and wrote so in an executive order that the rightful government should be restored. And so when I read that text, I look at it and I think, oh, this artist is acknowledging that Dole is in some trouble because he just got the US mixed up in an act of war, and his head might be on the chopping block there. That's why I'm referring to it also as possibly a chopping block with the axe next to it. Another, indicator that I mentioned is the shoreline. And I think it's significant because it signals American expansionism, which was also, a very prominent discourse. It was, along with Manifest Destiny, it sort of Manifest Destiny being, of course, that American expansionism was both justified and sanctioned by God, and that the inevitable overtake of the world was just the fulfillment of this particular, destiny, and Hawaii being a part of that. So when I look at that shoreline, I kind of conjure these references to American expansionism and precisely what was happening in Hawaii during that time when Manifest Destiny was very much alive and well, and unfortunately, catastrophically affecting the Native communities all across the continental United States.
Thank you, Healoha. I really enjoyed listening to that and sort of making the connections between an image, which one, right, this is a caricature, so so the intent, right, is to make fun of or to provide a comic effect of a particular notable individual, right? But then there's also these other things that are happening within the image, which point to specific things happening in history, right? So there's this idea that art is information, right? So in this particular image, there's information about the sitter's skin tone, their cultural identity, but there's also information, as Healoha has described, about the particular artist's ideas about what is happening within that particular historical context, right? So lots of things sort of going on within this particular image. And I think when you're looking at caricature, particularly caricatures of people of color, it's incredibly important to both look at the image as it is, right? And sort of identify those elements of portrayal, right? The pose, the setting, the medium, the colors, but to also understand that, you know, you will have to do some research, right? You will have to go into the background of something because you may be missing certain symbols or certain indicators which lead to a much larger or complex story. Now, the second part of this activity, first part was see, the second part is wonder. So Healoha, what does this portrait make you wonder? What are you puzzled by when you look at this particular image?
You know, I wonder why the figure is wearing tights and high heels on the beach. I mean, I
That's a
know
great
that sounds
question.
like a really practical thing, but that just, I look at it and I go, oh no, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. You know, but then it does, you start to then understand the reflection of the artist more so than the reflection of the individual being portrayed, because, you know, the queen, instead of looking regal, is sort of made to look like a showgirl with those tights. And so I wonder what culture is being referenced through those tights, because I can't make that reference within Hawaiian culture, or even within the context of Hawaii in the 1890s when this was drawn. So there's a cultural reference that I don't know in the tights. And so I wonder that.
And that's a really absolutely wonderful observation, right? There's another conversation that's happening within this image with links to something else, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But before we move on to the third part of the activity, I wanted to provide a little bit more information about Queen Lili'uokalani. And as some of you may know, she was the Hawaiian Kingdom's only reigning queen and the last monarch before the overthrow of the sovereign state in the late 19th century. She presided over the Hawaiian Kingdom during a time of great economic growth, and as Healoha has mentioned, during a time of intervention as well. Healoha, is there anything you'd like to add about the history of this really incredible woman to share with the audience?
Thank you. You know, Ashleigh, I appreciate that. And I just want to harken back to one of the references that was made earlier in this conversation. And it is to point out that, as Andrea mentioned, Queen Lili'uokalani continues to inspire generations today because she and her kingdom were very focused on the future and the next generation. And so I feel like as a descendant, as a Native Hawaiian and as an art historian, you know, how lucky and fortunate I am to have someone like Queen Lili'uokalani in my own history to be able to reference and to feel empowered by. Thank you.
So this particular image that we're looking at is a portrait from the National Portrait Gallery. It is a depiction of her from Judge Magazine, which was a satirical trade publication in the United States, which existed around the time of the Civil War until the Second World War. This was created by Frederick Victor Gilliam, who was known for his caricatures and political cartoons. And so this was something that would be shown in a trade publication, right? So that means that lots of Americans would be looking at this image and sort of thinking about the dissemination of images in the 19th century, right? And the understanding that, you know, for some folks, this actually might be the first time they're seeing an image of this woman, right? This might be their first sort of introduction to who this person is. And so keeping that in mind, we're talking about, you know, the power of caricature, right? And the power of harmful imagery. If this is the first time that you might be seeing someone, it has an impact, right, on who you think they are and whether you think they're notable or not. And so when you're sort of looking at this image, sort of keeping that in mind, right? We're talking about an image which might have been widely disseminated, which might have been certain folks' first introduction to this person. And what does that mean, right? That people in the United States who may not know who she is or may not know a lot about who this person is, what does it mean that this is the image that they might be seeing, right? So we're going to finish the activity. Next slide, please, which is connect. And so here's an image from Judge Magazine, the satirical magazine. And then here's an actual photograph of Queen Lili'uokalani from the late 1890s. And so for this last part for the activity, Healoha, you know, would you mind taking a moment to look at both images and respond to the question, right? What are the similarities? What are the differences between these two images?
They are both works on paper, but one is a photograph and one is an illustration. I mean, quite honestly, there's so many more differences than there are similarities. I'm looking for the similarities in order to try and find some. There's, yeah, I mean, the most prominent difference is that you would never guess that the photograph is of the same individual who is portrayed in the illustration. I think that's what comes through the strongest for me. You can see the very different kind of clothes being worn, the expression on the sitter's face in the Judge magazine illustration. The features are all like so exaggerated. Her face looks very distorted, in fact. And she looks like, I don't know. And then the face in the photograph by Menzie Dixon, she looks completely composed and self-possessed. And her wherewithal seems entirely present. And there's also, she's wearing what is an indication of royalty in the garment and in the what would have the sash is the word I'm looking for. She's wearing a sash. Again, looking for similarities.
Yeah, there aren't a lot, right? Yeah. I mean, these are really, I mean, when we're talking about caricature, yes, the point of caricature is to transform an individual into something slightly different, right? You're going to exaggerate the things that people make fun of them for. You're going to note things that people dislike, right? You're going to make notice of the things that make them either weird or different, right, in caricature. But with these two particular images, it's almost like erasure of who she really is, right? I mean, in the photograph, she's wearing westernized clothing, right? She's wearing her sash. In the image from Judge, I mean, she's wearing this crown, but it's on the side of her head. It's this tiny little crown, right? She looks very regal in the photograph, and in the caricature, it almost seems like they're trying to remove that regalness, right? And so I think, when we're talking about caricature, we're talking about, as the title says, we're talking about looking at a particular person through a distorted lens. And with caricature, it's not even just through a distorted lens, it's with a purpose, right? And with these particular images, some of that purpose is to actually highlight stereotypical ideas about what it means to be a Native Hawaiian, but to also erase the idea that she is a monarch. I mean, this is the age of Queen Victoria. We are in the Victorian era. So people are aware of monarchs, they're aware of the monarchy, right? It's a big deal. And so to portray this person in this way, in a lot of ways, is to downplay who she is. And that's what makes it a harmful image, right? And so I want to sort of move forward, next slide, sort of talk about this tradition, particularly in the 19th century, of using stereotypical or racist caricature to downplay, to belittle people of color, right? Because as you mentioned, there were certain things in the original image which spoke to nothing related to her Hawaiian identity, right? But spoke to other tropes that can be found in other racist or harmful imagery from the era. So right now we're looking at sort of two images from the National Museum of African American History of Culture. These are two what would be considered to be racist or stereotypical images. The image on the left is a figurine of a caricatured African woman and child. And then the image on the right is actually a cover for sheet music. This song called Abilene Snow, which is an African-American military ballad, right? And if you look at the two images, I mean, they're sort of things that come up, right? Also in the Queen Lili'uokalani image, right? There's the hoop earrings, right? Which are also an indicator in a lot of images for otherness, right? Particularly if you're talking about Black people, right? The hoop earrings are identifiers. Large lips, exaggerated noses, very bright clothing, right? The skirt that the woman is wearing and the figurine almost matches her tights in the judge image, right? They're very similar. Healoha, do you have any sort of thoughts about these two images?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the earrings, because that was one of the things that, you know, it also puzzled me that she was depicted in the judge wearing these big hoop earrings. I can definitely see how, you know, the reliance on primitivism in visual, you know, in art history, the primitivism is this depiction of people from parts of the world outside of Europe and the United States. And it certainly relies on particular assumptions that people are, people who were being primitivized in visual, cultural, and in art were incapable of self-governance, or were like children who needed parents.
Yep.
And that they, you know, were unenlightened, right? Which of course contradicts the fact that Queen Lili'uokalani spoke multiple languages, was a brilliant leader and governor of an entire country, and was a world diplomat and well-traveled. You know, so there are many things that contradict the whole primitivist paradigm, but you know, the depiction of primitivism in visual culture relies on people not knowing anything about that. And you can see it playing out in these very same objects that you've selected here, Ashleigh, that you're presenting. They're reliant upon the same discourse that treats certain groups of people as being, you know, incapable.
And so we're going to circle back to the original image. And so we've talked about these really different concepts, right? We talked about history, culture, right? Primitivism, which is, you know, a very long standing trope within art history, right? And other forms of visual culture. And I want to sort of get back to the idea that this particular image actually aligns the Queen with Blackness, right? So the idea is, you know, by using these racist tropes of both Native Hawaiians, but also Black people, they're aligning this person with Blackness, which is seen as a bad thing, right? Which is seen as being lesser than, right? So instead of actually providing a caricature that, you know, at least speaks to, you know, who she was, right? Because you're not going to see a caricature of Queen Victoria in a grass skirt, right? You're not going to see a caricature of Queen Victoria and doing, like, looking the same way, right? And so this idea that, you know, in order to understand who she is, because she wasn't white, she's Black, right? Like that's the only way, or that's one of the ways to depict this person, right? But by doing that, by using, you know, these racist tropes, you're, like I said, you're erasing who she is. And like you said, she spoke multiple languages. She was well-traveled. I mean, she was, you know, she was a suffragist, right? She was so many things during her lifetime. And these things are not being acknowledged in this image. I sort of want to talk a little bit more, Healoha, about what that actually means, right? And we're thinking about the history representation of Hawaiian Americans, particularly at this time. What does it mean that this particular artist has made the decision to align this individual with Blackness?
Well, I think, you know, you touched on some really important points there, Ashleigh, about, you know, these being images, racist images, they're anti-Blackness, right? And these kinds of images were used as propaganda to be anti-monarchy. And so these kinds of images basically relied on the ignorance of the consumer, that would basically not be able to fill in any gaps, not have any dots to connect, except to completely racist notions of both Native Americans and Black people on the continent that they were incapable of ruling or governing, incapable of making competent decisions. Certainly they were uneducated and all these other things, without acknowledging the systems of oppression and the power, essentially, that goes along with reinforcing these kinds of images. Yeah, I think the artist was, in this image, drawing a connection both to the fact that Native Americans had been displaced, violently forced off their own land, and were treated like they were incapable of their own governments as well. They're relying on people to believe that. They're relying on the consumer to believe that African Americans are incapable and uneducated, and therefore then making that leap to think, well, clearly this person is like Black people and Native Americans, and therefore is also incapable of governing, and clearly must be uneducated, and we would be, America would sort of be the hero who rescues these people from their own independence and sovereignty.
Yeah, and I want to sort of circle back to the definition of tolerance that I provided at the start of the session, right? Which is an understanding of the practices and beliefs of others, even if they are different from your own. Do you think that this particular artist demonstrates tolerance?
No, I think not. I think this artist is certainly a product of their time, where the devastation of racism across the continental US certainly formed their lens, and that comes through in the image.
Yeah, I know that there's so much to talk about this particular image, but I sort of want to end at least my portion with talking about storytelling, right? Because each work of art tells a story, right? And that story is crafted by the artist, it's crafted by their impressions of the sitter, and it's crafted by the time in which they are in, right? And I think with this particular story, I think we could use this particular work of art as an example of storytelling of a particular, of two things, right? So there's this story that the artist is trying to tell about a particular person, about a particular nation, right? There's that story, right? The story that erases their history, the story that erases their culture, and the story that connects them to non-whiteness. But I think, from that story in the present, I think we could still use this particular work of art to learn about perceptions of, a particular group of people or a person. So while this story the story being presented may seem lazy, right? That this artist didn't really take the time to understand the sitter and to understand who she was and who she represented. I think, in 2020, I think we could look at images like this and understand that, we have to dig a little bit deeper. We have to. There's just no way. This doesn't even tell a little bit of the story, right? There's markers, right? But we do have to dig a little bit deeper to actually figure out who it is that we're looking at, right? And I think with caricature and with imagery, you can't just use the image sometimes, right? You really do have to do the work, to do your research, to ask questions, and to figure out, who am I looking at and what is the purpose of this particular image? Because I think, with images that are harmful, such as this one and the other two objects that were previously shown, it's incredibly easy to see things, to understand, to think that they were made in a vacuum, when a lot of the time these images were not made in a vacuum. They're part of a large history, a large discourse about the representation of people who are not white in this country, as you mentioned, Healoha. And I think that it's really important to recognize that. I know that Healoha, you wanted to say a few words about sort of what it is that we're looking at to the audience.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand that oftentimes when you're looking at a work of art, what you're really seeing is a much closer depiction of the artist than the sitter. And that's where I think the research comes in, is understanding what was the artist's background and what were the conditions that would have set their paradigms and their realities, in order to see more clearly why it is that the sitter does not look anything like the photograph of Queen Lili'uokalani. And so oftentimes, this is certainly the case in 20th century art of the Pacific and 19th and 20th century art of the Pacific, is that a lot of it was produced by foreigners who did not have familiarity with even attempting to render. Like, they didn't have the skill set to draw particular features because they weren't the ones they were used to drawing. And they also didn't necessarily have the same respect or appreciation for the people and cultures they were visiting. And so what you see are distortions that are actually a closer representation of what would be maybe like, you know, European and American cultural values. Yeah.
Precisely. Thank you.
Well, thank you both very, very, very much. This is an amazing presentation. I have learned so much from this, and I want to thank both of you. Thank you, Healoha. Thank you, Ashleigh, so much for not only modeling this activity, but I think peeling back so many important layers into really the complexity and the complications and the problems associated with this image. So thank you, first and foremost. This is an incredible presentation, and for those who are viewing, we hope that you'll visit this webpage, smithsonianapa.org/learn/not-a-stereotype, to access educational resources such as learning lab collections and more associated with this particular talk, to learn more about caricatures, portraiture, and about Queen Lili'uokalani directly. If you would like to watch similar videos to this one, please access this website to view more talks like this and to meet fabulous educators like Healoha and Ashleigh. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to shift gears now. So I'm going to exit the screen and we're going to have a Q&A. Thank you both so much. My mind is kind of swimming with a bunch of questions, but for this Q&A, I'd like to expand upon some things that you touched on in the talk, but I thought I'd open it up addressing who we're making this for in this series and these talks. And, you know, we're hoping that educators tune in and watch this talk too, because caricatures often show up in textbooks and other educational materials to show students how individuals and groups of people are harmfully stereotyped and exaggerated as a way to gain some insight into cultural and political attitudes and sort of expand on political moments of the time. And in thinking about this talk, what are some lasting impacts that you see from this particular caricature, but other caricatures today?
Well, you know, I'll take it first, and then Ashleigh, I'll turn it over to you, because I think there's certainly lasting legacies to this type of visual culture. And I think probably among the most prominent is simply this idea that that colonialism is justified, and that you know, the need for certain people to be in positions of power and certain people to not be in positions of power. And I think that legacy of power, you know, we sometimes underestimate the power of visual, the power of art, but it is because it is so effective because people underestimate it, I think, in some ways. And so it's easy for images like this to be considered less a priority to unpack. And I think because they are so pervasive and because they are enduring, their images, and they fix in people's minds, and sometimes they play at people without people even realizing, right? It's like that subversive kind of function that art and visual culture can play. You know, I just see art as being a really important role in not only like deconstructing as we're doing now, but then reconstructing and envisioning the possibilities for different ways of interacting that don't necessarily require or rely upon the same kind of power and oppression dynamic that I think these stereotypes reinforce. And I mean, Ashleigh, I'd be interested in hearing more about how you think that plays out, given the images of African Americans who were stereotyped, and the kind of like reliance upon tropes of anti-blackness that then were like exported basically and were applied to people around the world.
Yeah. I wanted to return back to something so important that you said, Healoha, right? This idea of people of color with power are dangerous, right? This woman is dangerous because she is a sovereign, right? And this idea of people of color having authority, having power is a very dangerous thing, and something worth mocking, and something worth belittling, and something worth erasing. And so I think, thinking about the history of imagery of people of color, period, I mean, this is something that happens time after time after time. I'm thinking of, I think it was a New Yorker portrait of Michelle and Barack Obama with the terrorist fist bump, right? Where he is in particular garb, right? And that's from, 10 years ago, 10 plus years ago, right? This idea of mocking people of color with some sense of authority, or people of color and power, I think is something that still continues, right? The danger, the fear that comes from, people of color and power is something that's still very pervasive today. And I think it's something that, continues, and it's still worth exploring.
Thank you for those answers. It leads me to a follow-up question. For those who might be considering adding a caricature such as this one into a lesson or some kind of resource, what are some further careful considerations we can take in the choices that we make to include caricatures from any time in some kind of teaching moment or some kind of lesson?
Yeah, I'll start off. A few years ago, I went to a really fantastic talk by two archivists, an archivist and a professor at university, who were using their imagery of racist postcards and other memorabilia of African Americans to teach students about race. And as they were teaching the class, one of the few Black students that were in the class actually got incredibly upset and started crying, right? Had a very visceral reaction to seeing these images time after time. And one of the things that they mentioned was that there's something that they did not consider. They did not consider the fact that images such as this would have a negative reaction, right? From particularly the people that they were studying. And I think that it's incredibly important, these images are really great tools, but I think it's really important to always remember who's in your classroom, and to remember to have things in place where you acknowledge what it is that you're looking at, you acknowledge the harm that may be caused by viewing these images, but also have support in place for students, right? So if there is a student who sees this image and it's like, this makes me feel incredibly uncomfortable, or I don't like this image, or this makes me feel really bad about myself, to be able to have the language and to have the support in place to say to that student, I understand, and I empathize, and I apologize, right, for using this image. Here is why we are using these images. You have every right to take a break if you need to take a break, right? To put students in a position where they feel uncomfortable or sad or upset, that's not a learning, I mean, that's a learning opportunity, but not the one that you want, correct? And so it's important to be upfront with your students, particularly students of color that might be in the room, or students that might be affected by what's being seen, to talk to them and to address that beforehand.
I think the only thing that I would add to that, Ashleigh, and I'll share it just from my own personal experience, is when I look at caricatures of Queen Lili'uokalani, of course, I'm able to identify that it's totally bunk, right? Because we know that she was, her entire motto was based on education. She was highly educated. Hawaii had national health care. Women and children had a particular place within the kingdom for care and education. I mean, but not everybody has that background. And so I think if this is the only point of reference that someone in a classroom has, and it's a caricature, the way that would affect a person on the inside, like how that could be internalized because they don't have the other positive points of reference that help them to see, oh, this is a little nonsense. So like the exercise of having the two images to compare and contrast, or to make sure that, as Ashleigh, you pointed this out, that the artwork is really contextualized. But I think, again, the limitation of words compared to pictures, I think there's real power in having the alternative there, depending on the age of the students, so that they do understand and can internalize also the very powerful and positive imagery, which will then only reinforce the problems associated with the negative imagery. And I think that goes a long way, especially for young people who have always seen their culture depicted in a negative light. They need to see the positive.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for touching on a really important consideration in choosing an image like this for the classroom, or any of the images in this presentation, is trauma. And seeing yourself in this way, if you do see yourself in this way, it can lead to, as Healoha said, further belief about, who you are, how people may perceive you, but also how you might be valued, or how you're not valued. And it's very dangerous. And so I think, for those listening to both of you, and the considerations to expand further, to also be very careful about what you select and why you're selecting it is a very important thing to consider. And your answers actually lead me to my third question, which is kind of bringing it into this moment. Both of you talked about, current moments in 2020 and how we see this harm, a lack of tolerance, frankly, and trauma impacting people today. We have seen moments of blackface and brownface continuing today in popular culture and social media. We've seen a number of resignations, but we see it continuing over and over again. And so, we've talked about lessons we can learn, but in just thinking about how in this year we see it happening so much, what lessons are we just not learning? What are we not talking about to make sure that we can erase this completely?
I think, I actually just, Andrea and I just finished working on this week-long program with teachers from the state of Virginia. And, the last part is always the call to action, right? So we have this information, so what? What are we gonna do with it? And I think, with these particular images, thinking about the ways in which we can inspire students to say, okay, well, if you see something that looks like that, call it out, right? If you see someone posting stuff like this, call it out, right? So to inspire students to stand up and to speak out when they see stuff like this, right? Or to say to the person sitting next to them who may be affected by it, I'm sorry, I see you and I'm sorry, but that's not you, right? So I think, creating environments or creating conversations where you can inspire students to say, okay, we know what this imagery looks like, we know how to identify it. Here are ways in which, if we're watching a movie, right? If we're watching a movie or a TV show, particularly if we're watching a movie, in the 1940s, right? If we're watching a movie or anything that's old, being able to say, you know what, I can identify what it is that I'm watching, and I know that it's not right. And I know that it's something that's not worth supporting, right? And so inspiring students to move beyond knowledge building and to inspire them to speak up, particularly those who are not Asian or Black, right? Inspiring those students to say, you know what, this isn't right, and to sort of really take action on, speaking out.
Ashleigh, I totally agree. And I think we've seen that is actually an effective method. We're seeing that happen today with people being encouraged to find their voice. And I think that's one of the things that I would add to it, is simply, I think the danger of oversimplification shows up in so many ways. It shows up in these caricatures, right? And the need for people to be able to find their own voice, to be able to assert their own story, and to fill in some of those oversimplified narratives with specificities and with pride and with care and attention, like that lazy storytelling approach, like to be able to say, no, we're going to take a more careful and rigorous approach to telling a story, and to kind of understand that this is all a form of storytelling, and these are all narratives that the next generation is going to inherit. And so there's some responsibility here,
Yeah, and I love that, Healoha, responsibility, right? It's when we're talking about anti-bias, anti-racist, it's everyone's responsibility, right, to make things better for the people coming after us.
Absolutely. And for my final question, I'd love to leave it kind of open-ended. But what does Queen Lili'uokalani mean to you?
Well, I'll start by saying that there's a single word, onipa'a, and it became a word that it was one of her mottos, and it was the motto of an ali'i who preceded her. And onipa'a means to be steadfast and to persevere. And so when I see the word onipa'a used, you know, it reminds me of her and the legacy of being steadfast and not giving up. And that's where the responsibility comes in, right? You know, our responsibility to continue, and I think, like, I find a lot of power just in that single word, and the way that she used that word to define policies in her government.
I think, you know, coming into this position and coming into the Smithsonian's American Women's History Initiative, it's made me more cognizant of the fact that, one, everything is connected, right? All these stories are connected, right? There are folks all over the world, all over the United States, right, whose stories are so similar. And I think that it's so important to find connections where they exist. And then once you find those connections, to promote the bejesus out of these people, right? And so as a part of my job, I feel more inspired when I think about, you know, even in just the 7 months I've been at this job, the amount of history that I've learned just by learning about one person, right, I think is incredibly empowering, but really inspires me to move forward and to keep going, because, you know, one of the things that happens sometimes is that we sort of focus on one person and that one person is it, right? But with stories like this, it's really important to dig a little bit deeper. And I think with Queen Lili'uokalani, I think, you know, what I admire about her so very much is that, you know, even, you know, the research that I've done, there's still more stuff to dig up. Like she just has so much happening during her life, right? And I think, you know, those are the stories that I want to see. And so it's my responsibility as an American Women's History curator to be able to find platforms to showcase women like her, because everyone says, you know, sometimes people say, you know, these people don't exist, right? Or these stories don't exist, but these stories actually do exist. And there are people who are examples of what you can do when you know that you're smart and you're awesome, right? And you know that you can go on and do really amazing things, and you care deeply for the people that you serve. And so I think I'm just inspired by her story and inspired to dig deeper and to push myself to learn more.
These are incredible answers. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm inspired by two very powerful women here in this conversation. Well, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Ashleigh. Thank you, Healoha, so much for this talk. This has been a really tremendous experience.
Thank you for having me.